I didn't know that a single decision at 20 years old would haunt me for decades, or that the universe would one day hand me a chance for revenge so clean, so poetic, it almost didn't feel real. But before we get there, let me take you back to where it all began, back to the time when I was fresh out of high school, hungry for a future, and naive enough to think that talent automatically meant goodness. Back then, music was everything to me. I breathed it, lived it, dreamed it. My bedroom walls were covered in posters of bands I admired, and my guitar practically lived in my hands. Every night, I played until my fingers burned and the world around me faded away. So when I discovered a local band that was gaining real traction, the kind of buzz that felt like the start of something big, I was hooked. They had this raw, electric energy, songs that hit you in the chest, a record that felt like it belonged to a band on the verge of breaking out. When they asked me to join them on tour, it felt like the universe had reached down and tapped me on the shoulder. I remember the moment clearly. I was standing in this tiny practice room, still smelling faintly of sweat and spilled soda, when the singer made the offer. His voice carried this weight, this confidence that made me feel like I was being chosen for something important. I didn't hesitate, not even for a second. What I didn't realize was that the very person offering me the opportunity was the same person who would shatter my confidence, crush my spirit, and mark me in ways that would take years to undo. His name was Greg. At first glance, Greg looked every bit the seasoned musician. He was older than the rest of us, maybe 10 years older than me. He had this rugged look, a worn leather jacket, hands decorated with faded tattoos, and a voice that carried authority even when he whispered. For a young musician like me, he felt like a mentor, someone with real experience, someone I could trust. But underneath that exterior was a rotting core I didn't yet see. The first red flag burned bright even then, but I didn't recognize it. Greg was the only original member left in the band. Everyone else from the record had quit, every single one. I remember asking casually about the old members, wondering how a band could go from recording something so powerful to replacing its entire lineup before the tour even started. Greg laughed it off, said something about creative differences, but his tone was sharp, dismissive, like the topic annoyed him more than it should. I brushed it aside. I was young. I wanted my chance. The rehearsals started off fine, even fun at times. We spent almost a month practicing, tightening the set list, building chemistry. The band felt like a second family, the kind of people you bond with through late nights and shared dreams. There were moments I'd go home buzzing with excitement, feeling like I was stepping into the life I always imagined. But the truth was simmering beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to burn through. That moment came the day the tour began. We loaded our gear into the van, everyone laughing, cracking jokes, buzzing with anticipation. It should have been the start of a dream. The air was thick with that feeling you get when something big is about to happen. I climbed in, shut the van door, and that click of the latch closing felt like the closing of a chapter I didn't yet realize I'd regret. Because the second the door shut, Greg changed. He didn't ease into it. There was no slow transition. It was as if a mask had fallen away and the true Greg finally stepped forward. He snapped at someone about how the gear was stacked, cursed at another bandmate for something insignificant, and then turned to me with this cold, judgmental glare that made the hairs on my neck rise. That was the first moment I felt the shift in my stomach, the subtle, creeping sense that I had made a mistake. But that was nothing compared to what came next. The next 2 weeks became the worst experience of my life. Greg's behavior didn't just worsen, it escalated dramatically. Every day, every hour, every minute became an exercise in endurance. He picked apart everything I did, my playing, my posture, my expressions, my very presence. Nothing I did was right. If I tuned slightly differently than he wanted, he mocked me. If I played well, he belittled me. If I made a mistake, he humiliated me. His words were sharp, like barbed wire wrapped in sarcasm and venom. The kind of insults that don't just sting, they cling to your skin long after they're spoken. He found my insecurities quickly, as if he had a radar for weakness, and exploited every one of them. I began to dread waking up every day, dread soundcheck, dread stepping into another venue with him lurking nearby. But the worst moments weren't private, they were public. On stage in front of crowds of people, he made comments about me, snide remarks disguised as jokes, comments about my ability, my age, even my appearance. The crowd would laugh because they thought it was part of the act. I forced a smile, pretended it didn't bother me, but inside I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller. There was one night I'll never forget. We were in this dimly lit bar that smelled like stale beer and cigarette smoke. The crowd was loud, a little rowdy, and the energy should have been intoxicating. But mid-set, while I was tuning between songs, Greg leaned into his mic and said loud enough for the entire bar to hear, "Can someone teach the kid how to tune? We don't have all night." The room erupted with laughter. My face burned. My hands trembled. I remember blinking hard, trying to swallow the rising lump in my throat. I played the rest of the show on autopilot, praying it would end, praying nobody else noticed how broken I felt inside. Sleep offered no escape. Nights were filled with anxiety, replaying his words on loop, wondering what tomorrow's humiliation would be. The other band members weren't much help. Some were too intimidated to speak up, others were too beaten down themselves. It wasn't just me he targeted, but I was his favorite punching bag. I was young, eager, impressionable, the perfect victim in his eyes. By the time we reached the final show of the tour, something inside me had fractured. My hometown should have felt comforting, a place where familiarity and warmth softened the edges of the world. But instead, it was a reminder of how far I had fallen. When the show ended, I went straight to my parents' house. The moment they opened the door and hugged me, everything I had been holding in for 2 weeks collapsed. Tears I didn't know I still had poured out of me. It was like my body finally had permission to break. My mom held my face, asking what happened. My dad rubbed my back. And I just cried for the pain, cried for the lost excitement, cried for myself. The next day, when we got home, I quit, and I walked away from that nightmare. I didn't see Greg again, for 20 years, but time doesn't always bury the past. Sometimes it circles back, taps you on the shoulder, and asks if you're ready for closure. And one day, completely out of the blue, that tap came. 20 years had passed. I'd built a different life, grown stronger, found success, learned my worth. The scars Greg left had healed, but the memory of his cruelty lived somewhere deep inside me. Not in a way that controlled me anymore, but in a way that reminded me of how far I had come. One afternoon, my dad, now the general manager of a large business, called me. His voice held that tone, the one he used when something interesting happened. He said, "Hey, so I just got a resume from someone with a name I think I recognize. Does the name Greg sound familiar to you?" I froze. Greg? That Greg? The one who made my 2-week tour feel like a lifelong trauma. Dad kept talking. "He listed you as a reference." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the universe had just delivered the cleanest opportunity for justice I'd ever seen. After all his ego, after all his cruelty, after all the people he burned through, Greg had finally run out of opportunities. The music industry had spat him out. He had nowhere left to go, and now he wanted a job under my father, and he listed me as his reference. He didn't remember me, but I remembered everything. My dad asked, "So what's your experience with him?" And I told him the truth, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just the truth. The truth was enough. My dad listened quietly, not interrupting once. When I finished, he exhaled and said, "Thank you. That's all I needed." A week later, the decision came back. Greg didn't get the job. The door that he finally, desperately wanted to open, slammed shut right in his face. And for the first time in my life, a wrong that had never been righted finally was. My past had finally met its justice, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The feeling of justice, like a quiet, steady river, began to wash over me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no public confrontations, no bombshell moments. It was subtle, almost gentle, but there was no denying it. The moment Greg received the news that he wasn't getting the job, something shifted. I never heard from him again. Not that I expected him to reach out to me. After all, I had no reason to believe he'd even recognize my voice, let alone remember how he'd tormented me all those years ago. But knowing that he had tried to get that job, that he had put himself in a position where I could easily step in and block him, was a form of closure I hadn't known I needed. It wasn't just the satisfaction of watching him fail. It was the sense that everything had come full circle, that all his years of selfishness, manipulation, and arrogance had finally caught up with him. In a way, he had brought this upon himself. It made me reflect on how quickly time had passed. It's funny how when you're younger, everything feels so urgent. Every slight, every setback feels like it could derail your entire life. But the truth is, time has a way of putting things in perspective. The wounds I had from that tour didn't sting as much anymore. I'd learned to let go, to rise above. But this moment, this small act of retaliation, felt like a weight being lifted off my shoulders. It was like all those years of frustration had finally found a peaceful, quiet resolution. What struck me the most, though, was how Greg had never changed. How, after all this time, he hadn't learned a thing. His entire career was built on manipulation, power trips, and using others for his own gain. And when the music industry rejected him, when he had nothing left to lean on, he turned to something else, something new to manipulate. He thought he could slide into a corporate job and fool people the way he had fooled musicians, but I wasn't having it. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone like Greg crash and burn, and it wouldn't be the last. It wasn't even the first time I'd seen someone from my past try to come back, thinking the passage of time would erase their mistakes. There's a strange arrogance that comes with people like Greg. They think that just because enough time has passed, the hurt they caused, the damage they inflicted, will be forgotten. But what they don't realize is that we remember, we carry that weight with us. As I sat back and let the feeling of relief settle in, I started to think about everything Greg had put me through during that tour, all the times I had second-guessed myself, wondering if I wasn't good enough. All the late nights I spent questioning whether I could ever make it in music. Greg had planted those seeds of doubt, convinced me that I was just some kid who didn't belong. The emotional toll had been far greater than I ever realized at the time. But now I saw it for what it was, an abuse of power, a manipulation that was meant to break me, to control me. Greg wasn't just cruel for the sake of cruelty. He needed to feel superior. He needed to feel in charge. That's why he tore me down, why he made me feel small. He was insecure, terrified of being exposed as a fraud. Deep down, he knew he wasn't the big shot he pretended to be. But the only way he could maintain that illusion was by making everyone around him feel inferior. And in a twisted way, I think that's what made this revenge so sweet. It wasn't just about blocking Greg from getting a job. It was about proving that he hadn't won. It was about showing him that no matter how much he tried to tear me down, no matter how much he tried to make me believe I wasn't good enough, I had built myself back up. I had learned from my mistakes, grown stronger, and forged my own path. There was no way he could take that from me. I've thought a lot about Greg over the years. I've wondered how he's doing, what his life turned into. I heard bits and pieces over time. Stories from other musicians who had worked with him, each one worse than the last. No one had anything good to say about him. The music scene had long moved on, and Greg was just a name, a cautionary tale of a man who burned all his bridges until there was nothing left. I used to feel sorry for him, for a fleeting moment. I used to think maybe he just needed someone to reach out, to show him the way. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. People like Greg don't change unless they want to. And from everything I'd heard, everything I knew about him, I could see that he hadn't learned a damn thing. And that's when I understood something else. It wasn't about making him pay for what he did to me. It wasn't even about the job or the years that had passed. It was about the fact that people like Greg, who get away with treating others like crap, who use and abuse those around them to feed their own egos, they rarely face consequences. They rarely have to look back and see the damage they've caused. But I had the power to change that. For a long time, I thought the only way to heal from what Greg did was to forget, to bury it deep and move on with my life. But then I realized healing doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes healing is about facing the past head on, about seeing the damage done and choosing to make things right, even if it's in a small way. And that's what this was. My chance to make things right. To stand up for the person I used to be, the one who thought he wasn't good enough, the one who let Greg's words eat away at him. In a way, it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had lost during those 2 weeks of hell. For years, I had carried the weight of Greg's cruelty with me. I'd buried it under layers of success, of new experiences, of moving forward. But it was still there, quietly waiting. And when that resume landed on my father's desk, it was like fate had handed me the key to unlock that door. Greg thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. That time would erase the hurt he caused. But in that moment, I had the power to remind him that people like him don't get to just walk away unscathed. It's not when they've made others suffer. It wasn't about the job, really. It was about sending a message. It was about showing him that he couldn't hide from his past. And it was about giving myself the closure I didn't even realize I needed. When I look back now, I realize how much that moment changed me. Not just because of the revenge, but because of the lessons it taught me. I learned that revenge isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is the one you don't have to do anything for. Sometimes all you need to do is step out of the way and let karma take its course. But I also learned something else. People like Greg, people who tear others down to build themselves up, don't always realize how far their actions reach. They think they're invincible, untouchable, and that the world revolves around them. But sooner or later, the universe has a way of leveling the playing field. No one gets away with treating people like trash forever. And in the end, it wasn't just Greg who got what was coming to him. It was me too. Because for the first time in years, I finally felt like I had reclaimed my power. And that felt better than any job rejection ever could. As time passed, I tried to let go of the bitterness I had carried for so long. There were days when I'd forget about Greg altogether, days when life just moved forward. I'd put all of that behind me, focusing on my career, my family, and the relationships I had built. But every so often, the memory of him would pop up like a ghost that refuses to stay buried. And when it did, I'd find myself thinking about the odd twists of fate, how the past always seems to have a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. That thought lingered as I sat in my office one afternoon, sipping coffee, scrolling through emails. I'd heard some rumors about Greg's failure in the music industry. People would mention his name in passing, mostly as a cautionary tale. Oh, yeah, Greg, he was a real piece of work, wasn't he? And I'd feel this flicker of satisfaction, knowing that the damage he had done to people like me hadn't gone unnoticed. But I also knew that he hadn't learned anything from it. He had simply moved on to a new victim pool, and that's when I realized something. I wasn't the only one he had hurt. The more I thought about it, the more it struck me. Greg's pattern of cruelty wasn't just confined to me. It wasn't a one-time thing or some isolated incident. Greg was a force of destruction. He didn't just have a bad day or a brief moment of selfishness. He was like this by design. The more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that Greg had caused untold damage over the years, leaving behind a trail of broken people in his wake. And yet, he had always managed to slip away unscathed, landing on his feet every time. He didn't face the consequences he deserved. Sure, he lost his career. Sure, his reputation took a hit. But the people he had hurt, the ones who had suffered at his hands, most of them never got closure. They never had a chance to make him pay, to hold him accountable for the abuse he'd caused. That realization stung. It stung because I knew deep down that many of the people who had been a part of Greg's life, his bandmates, the people who worked with him, the friends he betrayed, were still out there, still carrying their scars. They were still haunted by the same things I was. And I couldn't help but feel this growing sense of responsibility. If I could help someone else, if I could stop Greg from continuing to harm others, then maybe it would all be worth it. But how? How could I ever reach those people? How could I make them understand what I had learned? How could I convince them that Greg wasn't just a musician who fell from grace, but a man who needed to be stopped before he could ruin even more lives? And then, one day, I had an idea. It came to me in this strange, almost surreal moment, as if the universe had sent me a sign, a way to bring everyone who had been affected by Greg together, to share our stories, to hold him accountable, and to finally, once and for all, expose him for the man he truly was. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Greg was still powerful in his own right. He had a reputation to protect, even if that reputation was built on lies. But what if I could shine a light on the real Greg? What if I could show the world who he really was, not the version he had spent years crafting for himself? I could already picture it, him trying to defend himself, spinning his lies, pretending to be the victim. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he tried to manipulate the truth, it would be impossible to erase the voices of the people who had suffered because of him. And so, I started reaching out. Slowly at first, I sent messages to people I hadn't spoken to in years, people who had been part of that original tour with Greg, people who had shared the same experiences. Some responded right away. Others took longer, hesitant to relive the past. But eventually, the stories began to flow. I wasn't the only one who had suffered under Greg's thumb. There were others, so many others, who had been emotionally broken, humiliated, and abused by him. The more I spoke with them, the more I realized just how deep Greg's toxicity ran. It wasn't just his behavior that had destroyed us. It was his manipulation, his ability to convince everyone around him that he was the hero, the genius, the tortured artist. In reality, he was nothing more than a bully. But he had built an empire on lies. I knew I couldn't let him get away with it anymore. Not just for me, but for all the others whose lives he had ruined. This wasn't just about one band, one tour, or one job application. It was about every single person who had crossed paths with Greg and come out scarred on the other side. We weren't just victims anymore. We were a collective. We were voices, and we were going to be heard. It was time for Greg to face the consequences of his actions, to finally understand that he couldn't keep abusing people, burning bridges, and moving on without paying the price. I started gathering everything I could, messages, stories, receipts of the abuse. I compiled it all into a document, a dossier of sorts, with the full intention of sharing it with anyone who needed to see it. I knew there were people in Greg's life now, people who hadn't seen the truth, people who had no idea who he really was. And I wasn't going to let them be manipulated by him. There was power in numbers. If enough people spoke up, Greg's house of cards would come crashing down. But as the days went on, something unexpected happened, something that shook me to my core. Greg got wind of what I was doing. He must have caught wind through the grapevine or through one of his old contacts. He reached out. It was a message, a simple text, but the words it contained sent a chill down my spine. It was from an unknown number, and the message read, "I know what you're trying to do, and I will destroy you before you get the chance." It was him, Greg, and his message was as clear as it was chilling. He wasn't going to go down without a fight, but at that moment, something shifted inside me. I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to take control of my story. I realized that Greg's threats were empty. He couldn't intimidate me anymore. He had spent years tearing me down, trying to break me, but now, I was stronger. And more importantly, I had something he didn't: the truth. Greg had always been able to manipulate others, to make them believe his lies, to twist the narrative in his favor. But he couldn't do that anymore. Not with me. Not with all of us. His reign of terror was over. And we were going to make sure of it. It didn't matter what he did next. It didn't matter if he tried to silence me or make me feel small. This time, I was in charge. This time, the truth was on my side. Greg had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated us. And that, as I would soon learn, would be his undoing. Greg thought he could scare me with a message. He thought a simple text could intimidate me into backing down. But the truth was, I had spent so many years running from his shadow that I had forgotten one crucial thing. I wasn't that scared kid anymore. I wasn't the same person who cowered in front of him on stage, who let his cruel words tear me apart. I was stronger now. I had grown, learned, and built my own life, one that Greg had no part in. And I wasn't about to let him, or anyone like him, dictate my story any longer. The more I thought about Greg's message, the more ridiculous it seemed. He thought he could destroy me with words. But what Greg didn't understand was that people like him only have power when others are afraid to speak up, when we let them control the narrative, when we stay silent out of fear. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I had the truth, and nothing could take that away from me. The decision to go public wasn't easy. It wasn't something I did lightly. The reality was that Greg was dangerous. He had the ability to ruin lives with a single phone call, with a whisper in the right ear. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to take the risk. If I didn't, Greg would continue doing what he did best, destroying people and moving on to the next target. I spent weeks organizing everything I had learned, talking to people who had been through the same hell I had. There were so many stories, so many people whose careers, dreams, and lives had been impacted by Greg. Some had lost their confidence, others had lost their passion for music, and a few had completely dropped out of the industry altogether, all because of Greg. His toxicity had poisoned the very thing we all loved, and I realized then that it wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my past or the pain I had suffered. This was bigger than that. This was about protecting others from going through what I had gone through. This was about exposing a man who had built a career on manipulation, cruelty, and control. I knew the risks. I knew that going public with all of this would make me a target. Greg would fight back, and he would fight dirty. But I had one thing he would never have, the support of the people he had wronged, and together, we were stronger than him. I created a blog, a simple, anonymous platform where I could share the stories of everyone who had suffered under Greg's reign. I reached out to former bandmates, ex-friends, people who had worked with him in the past, and slowly but surely, the stories began to pour in. It wasn't just me anymore. It was a community of people who had been affected by Greg's toxic behavior. They came forward not for revenge, but for justice. They wanted to be heard, to tell their truth, and to warn others about the man who had tried to destroy them. The more stories I posted, the more I felt the weight lifting off my shoulders. It wasn't just cathartic, it was empowering. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my past. I wasn't just a victim of Greg anymore. I was someone who had survived, someone who had risen above the abuse. The blog went viral. People started to share it, to spread the word. The stories, real, raw, heartbreaking, caught the attention of others in the industry. Greg's name became a red flag. People who had worked with him in the past came forward, and soon, he was being labeled as toxic. But it didn't stop there. Soon, I was contacted by a journalist, someone who had been following the story. They wanted to do a feature on Greg to expose his behavior to a larger audience. I was hesitant at first. This wasn't something I had planned. But after talking with a few others who had been affected, I realized this was the next step. We couldn't let Greg slip through the cracks again. He had to be held accountable. The journalists did their research. They interviewed me, the people who had worked with Greg, and anyone else who had a story to tell. The article came out, and it was everything we had hoped for. It painted Greg for what he really was, a narcissistic, abusive man who had used his position in the industry to control and manipulate everyone around him. And the best part, Greg couldn't escape it. His name was plastered across every news outlet, every social media platform. People were calling him out, leaving comments, sharing their own experiences. The people he had hurt were finally standing together, exposing him for the fraud he truly was. I knew that Greg would try to fight back. He would probably hire a lawyer, try to discredit the stories, call us liars. But it didn't matter. The truth had been set free, and no amount of lies or manipulation could undo that. What happened next was something I never could have predicted. Greg went silent for weeks. There was nothing. No public statement, no rebuttal. It was as if he had completely disappeared from the public eye. It was eerie, almost like he had been swallowed whole by the very monster he had created. He had no platform left to stand on, no allies to defend him. All he had was his own empty arrogance. Then, a few months later, the real consequences began to set in. Greg had tried to salvage his reputation by reaching out to other industry professionals, trying to rebuild his career. But the damage had already been done. The doors were closed to him. People who had once respected him now saw him for what he truly was. It was almost poetic in a way. He had spent his entire life building a facade, a fake image of power and success. But in the end, it wasn't his talent that destroyed him. It was his treatment of others, his cruelty, his need to dominate and control. Greg had always been the kind of person who thought he was invincible, untouchable. He thought he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it, but he had never anticipated the power of truth, the power of people coming together to expose his lies. In the end, Greg didn't just lose his career. He lost everything: his reputation, his allies, his chance at redemption. And that in the end was the sweetest victory of all. For me, for everyone who had been affected by Greg's actions, and for everyone who had ever been hurt by someone who thought they were above the law. The lesson, as cliché as it sounds, was simple: the truth always comes to light. It may take time, it may take effort, but eventually, it will find its way to the surface. And when it does, it has the power to tear down everything that was built on lies. And as for Greg, well, he was just a reminder that no matter how high you climb, no matter how powerful you think you are, there's always someone watching, waiting to hold you accountable. No one gets to escape their past forever. The dust had settled. The media attention slowly died down, but the damage was done. Greg, who had once been this towering figure in the music world, was now a shadow of his former self. His name had become synonymous with manipulation and abuse. His reputation was tarnished beyond repair, and for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just the satisfaction of seeing him fail. It was knowing that I had played a part in making sure that no one else would have to suffer at his hands. The people he had hurt, the lives he had ruined, they were no longer invisible. They had a voice, and I had helped give it to them. It was strange to think about how far I had come since those dark days of the tour, when I had thought my life was over. Back then, I had no idea how strong I was. I had no idea that one day I would be the one holding the power. But now, looking back, I realized that everything had led to this moment. Every painful experience, every moment of doubt, every tear I shed, it had all been necessary to make me who I was today. And in the end, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. The closure I had longed for had arrived, but it wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't just about avenging the past. It was about making sure that people like Greg didn't get to walk all over others. It was about sending a message that there are consequences for your actions, no matter how much power you think you have. No one is untouchable, and that was the part that I found the most satisfying, the knowledge that Greg had been taken down, not by force, not by some grand spectacle, but by the quiet, unrelenting power of the truth. He had no choice but to face the reality of what he had done. And it broke him. But the most remarkable thing of all, it wasn't the justice I served that made me feel empowered. It wasn't the way Greg's world came crashing down around him. It was the way the experience had changed me. For so long, I had let fear and insecurity dictate my life. I had let people like Greg define my worth. I had let them make me believe I wasn't enough. But now I knew better. I had learned that my strength didn't come from anyone else. It came from within me. I didn't need Greg's validation. I didn't need anyone's approval. I had finally taken control of my own story. And nothing could take that away from me, not even him. Looking back, I realized that the most powerful revenge wasn't about seeing Greg suffer. It wasn't about causing him pain or watching him squirm. It was about the sense of freedom I had gained from standing up for myself, for speaking the truth, and for refusing to let someone like him dictate my life anymore. That's the real power. It's not about getting even. It's about taking back what was yours all along, your voice, your worth, your peace of mind. The moment Greg received that rejection, the moment I saw him fade into the background, I knew that he would never be the same. He would never walk into a room with the same arrogance, the same belief that he could manipulate anyone he wanted. And that was the greatest victory of all. Because in the end, people like Greg don't realize something until it's too late. They don't realize that no matter how much they try to control others, they can never truly control themselves. And when the truth catches up with them, when the world sees them for who they really are, that's when their power slips away. That's when they fall from grace. And there's nothing sweeter than watching someone like Greg fall, knowing that you played a part in making sure they would never hurt anyone again. It's been years since all of that happened, but I can still remember the feeling of walking away from that chapter of my life. It was like shedding a heavy weight that had been hanging over me for far too long. And the best part, it wasn't just about me getting revenge. It was about knowing that, in the end, I had reclaimed my power. That was the true reward. As for Greg, well, he's gone from the public eye. He's a distant memory now, a cautionary tale. He may have once been a force to be reckoned with, but in the end, he was nothing more than a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. And in a way, that's the most satisfying thing of all. Because no matter how hard he tried to rebuild, no matter how many resumes he sent out, he could never escape the truth. So let this be a reminder to anyone who thinks they can walk over others without consequences. The truth has a way of coming out. And when it does, It has the power to destroy everything you've built. No one gets away with hurting people forever. And when the tables turn, when karma finally catches up, it's a feeling unlike anything else. And that's the end of the story. Odarao, if this story hit you in the gut, if you felt that deep sense of justice along with me, make sure to hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us about your own experiences with karma or revenge. Have you ever had the satisfaction of seeing someone who wronged you get their comeuppance? I'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to subscribe for more emotionally charged revenge stories, because you know we've got plenty more coming your way. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't a battle you fight, it's simply letting the truth take its course.